Hello. Today's Straight Talk is going to be on the contentious subject of patriarchy in relation to the wounded masculine. It might seem odd that a woman would be talking about the wounded masculine and patriarchy, but my work focuses around this subject, and I feel it's important to be able to talk about it because it's a really radically important subject. So first off, I want to just say that I'm a daughter, sister, wife, ex-wife, and mother of men. And I've had a lifelong experience of the wounded masculine, and it has had a profound effect on my life to the extent that it became my profession. I first started out with, from a self-employed perspective, to bring a masculine mentoring program to life, which I dedicated a couple of years of my life to, on and off with working in paid employment, to try and get funding in place to run this initiative. And unfortunately, because I couldn't get the funding in place, I got a lot of support for it, actually, from some really impressive places. But I think people were a bit sceptical about the possible connotations of mixing men with boys, which is crazy, I know, but that's the way we've got. We're so uptight about things that we need not to be uptight about. We need to keep in perspective. And I wasn't able to get the funding in place and ended up, closing that company down, even despite the amount of support that it got. So I mention that because I feel it's important that it's known before I continue that my passion is underpinned by my compassion for men and boys. So I wanted to really talk about it because it's a hugely significant issue, I think, in the world today, especially today, because of the way our culture is going, where it's so deeply controlled and manipulated by the patriarchal systems that have been put in place and been there for a long, long time, that if we don't talk about it, we're never going to be able to change it. My father was dad to me, somebody who I was very close to. Now, he grew up in a family with 4 sisters, and they were close right up until their 80s. They stayed in touch with one another right until their 80s. My dad was the first of the 4 to go, and he died in 2013. Now, he had a really, I can't really comment about how bad his experience was, but he was sexually abused by a priest at St. Bede's College in Whalley Range. And it was a pretty well-respected school. Only the smartest kids went there. I think it was all boys at the time. I don't believe it was residential, but I don't know enough about its history to know that. But I know he was abused there by a priest. And I know also that it profoundly affected him. I can't remember when exactly I found out that this happened to him. I know I knew about it. And then in his, probably, I would say he would have been in his late 70s. We used to walk together a lot. We were really close, myself and my dad. He raised the subject. Now, I can't remember what the conversation was about and how the subject came up, but he raised the subject of having been abused by a priest. And bearing in mind his age at the time, I knew that he was very troubled still about this experience he'd had in his younger years. I don't know exactly what age he was. I know it was, I'm fairly certain it was secondary school. And I know it deeply troubled him. I know that it had implications for my family, my family of origin. And those consequences were profound and far-reaching in my life of my father's wounding as a man. Excuse me. So I, even in terms of my own relationships as an adult, the kind of people I fell for, Now, I want to also mention that I am good friends, friends with my ex-husband, so there's no bad feeling left there. And, we have been able to laugh about some things. But my own marriage was abusive. And, I understood the patterns of how I ended up in that situation and how I enabled it. I see it as a dynamic, not as it's all his fault. He was to blame for everything. It was a dynamic, and I understood how that dynamic came about, and that's how I've brought that learning forward into my career today, where I focus primarily now on helping women who are in the same situation or have been affected by the same situation, so that they can not have to go through the things I had to go through for as long as I went through them, through the choices I made. So I bring a dynamic of deep understanding and deep compassion for men who are wounded into the work that I do today. However, I do talk straight, and I do totally believe that we all have to take responsibility for the things that we do, the things that we say, how we behave, the messages we give out. And I like to think, and I know from feedback I've had from people I've worked with, that I do bring that compassion for everybody concerned. So here's why I want to talk about patriarchy. Just recently, there's a piece of writing I did in 2016. I originally wrote the piece that is now just released as a work in its own right, as a book, an ebook. It's only 32 pages, but it's been read by quite a few women before I released it as a work in its own right, and people were profoundly affected by it. So it is about the dynamic. It is about how we come to this situation and what we must do to stop enabling it and to be able to make sure we don't fall into that kind of relationship in the future, and that we are able to protect children from the continuing pattern of what I see as patriarchal conditioning of men in particular, but also of women. So that all said, I just wanted to lay that foundation so anybody listening to this will see I am as far from anti-man as it's possible to be when I talk about patriarchy and the wounding of the masculine. What I see has wounded men as much as it wounds women is this culture of thou shalt not be emotional, thou shalt not be empathic or compassionate or able to step into the shoes of another human being so we can feel what other people might feel and experience as a result of our behaviour moving forward. So I look at patriarchy as a subject that we must explore with openness and honesty. It's not anti-man. It's a culture that we have to investigate and say, learn what worked, what didn't work, what's healthy and what's not healthy when we're talking about the relationship between men and women and between men and men. There are more men talking about patriarchy now and the wounding that it does in order to breed men that don't care, that don't have the capacity to feel. And that's most prevalent, in my view, my experience and my study, amongst men who are leaders. Because just recently I've been more attentive. I've always been aware of all this stuff. I've always had a great interest in it. But I've been talking to and reading and listening to podcasts around the damaging effects of patriarchy. People like Gabor Mate and Russell Brand and Gabor Mate did a fantastic podcast. I think it might even be 10 years ago now, but it's really good, and it's very funny, and it's very truthful, talking about wounded leaders and how all this has come about, that we're being governed by and have put into power people who have no capacity for compassion because it's been conditioned out of them in their younger years. So until we start being able to talk about the effects of patriarchy and how it's wounded men in particular, we're never going to be able to change things and bring more wisdom to how culture should be structured today, so that people don't continue to be wounded, so that families don't continue to be destroyed, so that apparently something I read about loneliness only recently talked about loneliness has increased hugely because there are vast numbers of men aged 45 to 60, I think, or 45 to 65, who now live alone, and that more divorces are instigated by women, my own included, and my mum's included, because of the behaviour, the aberrant behaviour of men who have been wounded by patriarchy. And both parties, men and women, are wounded. The wounding is different between men and women, but deeply felt by both. And this is why I believe that when we step back and say, oh no, patriarchy, I can't talk about that, what we do is enable the patriarchal conditioning to continue, i.e. that men will continue to be hurt by other men, feel excluded by other men, feel to have the wrong impression of how they should behave around women. As a quick for instance, I heard, I'm not going to say by where I heard it, by whom said this thing, but I heard directly a grown man say to a young boy who was then teenaged, and that boy was talking about being loving towards females, and the words came out, "That's not how you treat women. Treat them mean, keep them keen." And I nearly fell over hearing that being said. But what it did do was make me realise just how deep the conditioning goes, that women are less than men, and that the way to keep a woman and to keep a woman's interest is to treat her mean, so she stays keen. That's the truth of the matter, that there are many men who do that daily, treat women and girls, and I just have to interject here that there are universities who are suffering high numbers of rape of girls by boys, students, and who teenage relationships where the boys are abusive towards the girls. Now, I don't believe that all of patriarchal behaviour, which I refer to as machismo and macho, I don't believe that it's all intentional. Some of it, I think, is, and in certain people, it may be more intentional. But I also believe that there's a deep conditioning that's at play that may be unconscious, to some degree at least. I believe it's a behaviour that gets the desired results, and that it's quite possibly unconscious behaviour that gets results that feel good, but without there being any real thought about, so if she bends over backwards to treat me like king of the castle, and her life revolves entirely around me, that feels good. this is my take on it, that feels good. So I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. But if such a man who's behaving in an abusive way with a degree of unconsciousness and getting beneficial results, i.e., her life revolves around me, she doesn't go out with her friends because, I'm the king of the castle and I don't want her to go out and so on, that if he were to be made aware of what's actually going on, so when she's seeming to adore me, the truth is she's scared of me because of my displays of abusiveness and temper, apparently out of control behaviour that isn't actually out of control, it's very controlled. The first time that was put to me, I was gobsmacked because I'd been in the camp of he doesn't know what he's doing, he doesn't realise what he's doing, to suddenly realise, oh gosh, this isn't out of control behaviour at all was quite a shock to me, but a valuable learning nonetheless. So if a man becomes aware that his behaviour is actually intimidation, and that the behaviour he's getting back from the abused partner is not actually rooted in genuine love, but rooted in fear. Some men might be, the men who are doing this consciously, maybe, great. But other men, I think, would be, oh my gosh, the truth is actually very revealing about me and my behaviour. And do I want to really be thought of that way? And, fathers of girls say, do they want their daughters to be treated that way by a future partner? Fathers of sons, do they want to witness their sons treating a future partner that way? I suspect the lesson will be harder for them with daughters, where they've got daughters, because to have another man come on the scene and treat a daughter badly, he may not even see, well, why is she putting up with that? Because she's grown up seeing me behave that way towards her mother and towards her and, any other siblings, whether they're male or female. That, I think, would be more shocking to him than to a man who willfully and intentionally bullies and abuses his female partner. For those men willing to take this discussion on, and I think we women have a big role to play in facilitating that by stopping enabling abusive behaviour, and that's what my work is about at the moment, where my focus is, that we can have a role to play in waking men up by stopping cooperating with it, by standing up and speaking out, basically, but safely. Because if a man is violent and abusive to the extent where it's obviously a threat, we have to be really careful about how we step into our power. There are ways of doing it, and that, like I say, is what my work is about. But I think as a whole, our collective culture, we need to be talking about patriarchy and the damages of patriarchy and the damaging effects of wounded masculine. My experience of wounded men is that they can be far more destructive, far more bitchy, far more cruel and cold and spiteful than any woman I've ever come across in my life. In that maintaining a position of control or seeming control, men can be extraordinarily destructive and cruel. And I've seen that happen to my sons at the hands of strangers. I'm not going to go into specifics right now, but this is how wounded masculine continues, because wounded men continue to wound others. We hear that phrase, hurt people, and I will talk about that some more in another video. But that's how it continues. That's how the cycle continues, that wounded people pass on their wounding to other people. And when we're talking wounded men, we know that, generally speaking, men are more quick to become violent than a woman may be, or more predisposed to become violent, to kill a female partner, to kill children. I'm not saying that there aren't abusive women, because there are. And we have to look at that too. And it's as unforgivable and inexcusable as male abuse is. But the bigger problem, statistically speaking, is the how wounded men wound women and family. Wounded men are a hugely destructive force in the world. And until we're willing to come to the table with this subject to say, okay, I'm not thinking that you raise the word patriarchy, it means you think that all men are bad. It does not mean that at all. In the same way that Gillette didn't, I'm sure, intend to alienate all its customers, or a big chunk of its customers. I'm sure that was a big shock to the what I see as intelligent minds. I want to put this message out there that men, we have to stand together against this behaviour, because that is my take on it, that we have to get men standing up against patriarchal culture every bit as much as we have to, as women, stand up against the patriarchal culture. So that's really why I mentioned this subject today, why I'm talking about this subject today. And I know it will quite possibly raise all sorts of defensive comments and misunderstanding, but I hope that I've been able to raise the subject in a non-offensive way, or in a way that at least makes it clear that this is my understanding of patriarchy, and why we have to talk about this, because the need is so pressing in the world today, and probably more so than ever before, because of the oppressive culture, ever more oppressive, that we're living in today, where we're being forced to not speak about certain things by means of censorship and even imprisonment for certain people who've been brave enough to speak out about what's really going on in the world today. So I'm going to leave it there for now and invite a conversation from both men and women about their experience and their views. And as usual, I will ask for polite discourse and honest and open and vulnerable discussion. One thing that I won't ever do is to put people down for showing vulnerability and sharing their truth. I will always be straight talking, and I will always look for the right words to straight talk with. But I think we do have to start being more open and honest about our experience if we're ever going to change things for everybody's gain. Not just, there's a fantastic speech, I'm just going to finish on this, by somebody called Jackson Katz, who talks about working with men in talking about abuse, domestic abuse, as a man's problem, not a woman's problem, that it's poor leadership. I totally resonate with that. And I'd invite you to listen to that. Just look for Jackson Katz online. You'll see the talk, and it's an amazing talk. I believe that's how we have to look at things now, that we have to stand together, men and women, against this patriarchal culture that makes it okay for men to bully and abuse anybody, including one another. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this interesting, and I hope that you will engage in the discourse. I look forward to reading comments, and positive and honest and vulnerable comments as well, but preferably not aggressive and argumentative. Anyway, thank you for listening again, and look forward to talking with you again. Bye for now.